Welcome everybody to July's session of Manuscript Society's Manuscript Mondays. It's pleased to be here with all of you. Thank you very much for attending. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Manuscript Society. It was founded in 1948 as the National Society of Autograph Collectors and includes not just collectors but also manuscript curators, librarians, dealers, and auction houses, and has members from around the world, and not just North America but also Asia, Australia, Europe, and South America. The specific mission of the Manuscript Society is to encourage the collection and preservation of manuscripts and documents, to stimulate and aid collectors in their various collecting specialties, and to facilitate the exchange of information and knowledge among collectors, scholars, dealers, and the general public. In addition to Manuscript Mondays, the Manuscript Society publishes a quarterly journal, Manuscripts, and a quarterly newsletter, the Manuscript Society News. The Society also has a scholarship program. The Richard Moss Research Grant awards $10,000 to currently enrolled graduate students of membership institutions to support research in original manuscripts. Please visit the Manuscript Society website for more information. And finally, the Society holds an annual meeting offering members a fun-filled events, behind-the-scenes tours of different historical sites, manuscript museums, libraries, so forth. And this year, or 2027, it will be held in Chicago, Illinois. So keep an eye on the website for more information as the agenda is planned. We're very excited to have Dr. Lynn Ransom, the curator of the Schoenberg Institute for Manuscript Studies at the University of Pennsylvania Libraries, and the acting executive director of the Digital Scriptorium tonight. She'll be here talking about the Digital Scriptorium, which was launched in 2024 and aims to be the first national union catalog for pre-modern manuscripts in North America, built on linked open data technologies and practices. There has been similar attempts in the past, but Lynn's going to discuss the motivations and principles behind the redevelopment project and why it just might work this time. Currently, Lynn is the curator of programs at the Schoenberg Institute for Manuscript Studies at the University of Pennsylvania Libraries. Since arriving at Penn in 2008, she has overseen the Schoenberg database of manuscripts, an open access, user maintained finding aid for the world's pre-modern manuscripts, and since 2020 has led the development of the Digital Scriptorium Catalog, a growing online national union catalog for pre-modern manuscripts in North American collections. She has published widely on issues related to digital cataloging and manuscript description, as well as the illumination of devotional manuscripts of the 13th and 16th centuries, and currently serves as a co-editor of the Schoenberg Institute's journal, Manuscript Studies. So without further ado, Dr. Ransom, take it away.
Great, thank you. Great, and everyone can see the slide, right?
There we go, got it. Looking
awesome.
great.
All right, well, thank you, Jay and Lee. Thank you for that kind introduction. I'm delighted and honored to be asked to present to the Manuscript Society tonight and to share a few words on a project that has been at the center of my attention, some might say my life, for a few years now, and that is the Digital Scriptorium Catalog. So Digital Scriptorium is a consortium of North American libraries and museums that are committed to providing cross-institutional digital access to their collections of pre-modern manuscripts and dedicated to enhancing access and appreciation of historically significant but often understudied manuscript materials. So we fulfill this mission through the DS catalog, the Digital Scriptorium Catalog, which aims, as Jay said, to be a national union catalog that will document every pre-modern manuscript book or fragment in every North American collection. I say aim because the likelihood of reaching this goal is admittedly pretty low, if not impossible. But nevertheless, we at Digital Scriptorium have undertaken the responsibility of at least providing a technical platform, that is the catalog, as a first solid step towards that goal. So my talk tonight is thus an apology for putting forth the effort to create a national union catalog And and my purpose is to contextualize the catalog and the broader history of attempts to do much the same thing. The history of manuscript documentation is a long one and includes people who invested entire careers helping other researchers to locate manuscripts. It also includes those who have failed, those whose ambitions far and perhaps foolishly exceeded the practical limitations that time, human nature, money, and technology imposed upon their ideas, thus allocating their projects and their vision to the dustbin of history. Even though they were failures by conventional standards, we still, I maintain, have a lot to learn from them. So tonight I want to use this opportunity to reflect upon one such project that by most accounts was a failure, and to consider it as both a cautionary tale and as a model for how one might go about creating manuscript access at a large scale, because, spoiler alert, it's the model that inspired the new digital Scriptorium catalog. It's also a good story, in my opinion, and as far as any story about cataloging can be, I think it's an entertaining one. So in 1909, the American librarian Ernest Cushing Richardson stood before his peers at a meeting of the Bibliographical Society of America in New York and pronounced, "It would be a great, but by no means superlative task to make a complete binding list of all extant manuscripts in volume form up to the year 1500, at least in European languages. And it will most likely be done before many years past. If done, it may be expected from our experience that thousands of lost works will be automatically discovered or rediscovered, centuries of the time of historical scholars and textual critics saved, myriads of historical mistakes spared, other myriads of futile books prevented, and in general, a final saving made to human civilization of thousands of times the cost of the work." At the time he gave this speech, Richardson was one of the leading figures in American librarianship. He spent most of his career as the librarian at Princeton University from 1890 to 1925, then became the honorary consultant in bibliography at the Library of Congress, where he successfully oversaw the coordination and expansion of the National Union Catalog of Printed Books from 1927 to 1934. By all contemporary accounts, he was well regarded by his peers and was considered in his own time to be one of the architects of modern library science in the US. Here he is at a 1904 meeting of the American Library Association in St. Louis. He's on the left, of which he was a president of the American Library Association at the time. And through his involvement in the ALA, as well as the American Library Institute, which was a think tank for librarianship that existed from 1904 to 1941, Richardson shaped infrastructure and policies whose impact can still be felt today. He was known especially in regard to the ALA's work on international cooperation, as chair to the successive committees successive committees on international cooperation, 1900 to 1905, on international relations, 1905 to 1910, and on bibliography from 1922 to 1934. So given his credentials, Richardson's somewhat outlandish pronouncement on the possibility and potential of a finding aid for the world's manuscripts came from someone who understood exactly what a project like this would entail and was not blind to the challenges of its scale. Richardson thoroughly bought into the utopian ideals of internationalism that characterized this period's social and political ambitions, and he firmly believed that through international cooperation and sound project planning and using what were then innovative print technologies, anything could be achieved, including democratic access to all the world's knowledge, which was a major component of the internationalist agenda and the subject of another talk. It's a very fascinating area of research. I think that the history of librarianship, should pay attention to. But that's another talk. So why manuscripts? Richardson came to his career in librarianship, as many of us do, somewhat by accident. Following graduation from Amherst College in 1880, he went to Hartford Theological Seminary to pursue a master's in medieval theology. In his first year, he was hired as the assistant to the seminarian librarian and professor of ecclesiastical history, Chester B. Hartranft. And for his studies, Richardson focused on the relatively new field of textual criticism under the mentorship of the New Testament scholar Matthew Brown Riddle. Riddle had been a member of the New Testament Revision Committee that was formed in 1871. And based on this experience, Riddle came to understand and impressed upon his students the value of manuscript books as primary source materials for textual criticism, especially in regard to theological texts. He also imparted the difficulty and frustration the committee faced in finding the manuscript resources they needed to do the work, whether in American or European libraries. At the time, librarianship was, if I may simplify, a fairly local enterprise, and the ability for libraries to systematically make their resources available to researchers and across institutions was only beginning to evolve. For Riddle and other revisers of the New Testament, the task of physically tracking down manuscripts was laborious and expensive. Riddle's influence and instruction left a deep impression on Richardson, but his was not the only influence. To support himself through his studies, Richardson worked in libraries starting in his undergraduate years at Amherst College, where Melville Dewey served as librarian and invented the Dewey Decimal System. Regardless of the fate of the Dewey Decimal System today, it was nevertheless a remarkable and revolutionary accomplishment towards the universal classification of and democratic access to knowledge upon which modern librarianship is based. Throughout his education, Richardson continued to work in libraries, working in this profession with leaders such as Dewey, and at such an exciting time in its development must have been somewhat intoxicating for a young man about to set out into the world and seeking to be part of the change. So Richardson remained in librarianship, but he never lost interest in medieval theology nor in manuscripts. At Princeton, he managed to negotiate a 6-month on, 6-month off contract in which he spent half the year in Europe researching and searching for manuscripts to support his studies. A perk which, as you might expect, did not make him popular with his administration and staff over time, but we'll come back to that later. I'd like to return now to his idea of a finding aid for the world's manuscripts. As a librarian and a manuscript researcher who had spent a lot of time in undocumented libraries, Richardson understood that the number of known manuscript sources upon which his scholarship depended represented only the tip of the iceberg of what was available but hidden, to use his word, in libraries, archives, and private collections around the world. Richardson calculated at one point, based on extrapolated evidence from existing print catalogs of manuscript collections in Europe, that there were just over 2 million manuscripts in the world that were largely inaccessible to scholars due fundamentally to a lack of easily accessible documentation. The project that was expressed as an idea here in this quotation gained traction in later years. Richardson was able to begin work on his project when he began his tenure as the honorary consultant in bibliography at the Library of Congress in 1927, a post for which he took no pay after being more or less forced to leave Princeton. At Princeton, his demanding vision of a new type of librarianship and the self-imposed importance of his role in realizing that vision, as well as the fact that he was only present for half the year, became a problem for the administration who had to run a library. But his friend Herbert Putnam, the Librarian of Congress at the time, understood that these same qualities would make him the ideal candidate to guide the development of a National Union catalog of printed books, and he was. Richardson managed to solve the vexing problem of collecting data on books in libraries around the country with a simple but ingenious and elegant method of distributing the data collection to the local libraries, who would fill out the librarians would fill out basic bibliographic information on note cards at their institutions, then send those cards to the Library of Congress to collect and eventually publish. And this solution, managed to achieve impressive results in the short time that Richardson was responsible for it. And I suppose when you're working for free, you have a certain amount of liberty to also work on your pet projects. So after arriving at the Library of Congress, he began work to develop a method for documenting the world's manuscripts with the full support of the American Library Association. He called this project a Union World Catalog of Manuscript Books and published a demonstration of his method in 6 volumes from 1933 to 1937. And here you're seeing the title page of volume 6 with the list of the 6 volumes enumerated on the left side. The summary, by the way, was a mere 300 pages. Richardson described his Union Catalog of Manuscripts, Union World Catalog of Manuscripts, as little more than a card catalog that could be added to and rearranged over time. The method for producing this catalog, he believed, was applicable across manuscript traditions. And in this list of volumes, you can see that he executed or oversaw the execution of 2 demonstrations of the method, one for manuscripts in Spain and Portugal, carried out by Henry Grubbs. That's volume 2. Grubbs was a collaborator and professor at Oberlin College. And then another demonstration for what he called Oriental Manuscripts, volume 4, which used the Islamic collections at Princeton as a case study to show that his method could work across manuscript cultures. Employing a short title catalog method that he had developed at Princeton, which captured only the basic information needed to find a book, author, title, and publication information for printed books, he insisted that the entry on each manuscript in his catalog be limited to 1 line of 100 to 120 characters and contain only the most basic information that would help researchers identify manuscript copies of particular texts they might want to consult. This was to include author, title, location, shelf mark or other identifying number, including catalog references, dimensions, folio count, material, and date, if time and space permitted. Entries were to be typed on a single 7.5 by 12.5 centimeter index cards and placed at the top of each card in 1 line to facilitate convenient overlapping and photostatic copying. Authors' names were to be given in full, but other details were to be abbreviated to the highest possible degree. These guidelines were established so that the entries would fit on one 29M linotype bar, which with compressed 6-point type would permit the 100 to 120 character per line limit if the catalog were to make it to print, which he never felt was a necessary outcome. A slug would be created for each entry and kept in an envelope. The envelopes would be sorted alphabetically and updated as necessary. A typical entry printed for his demonstration of the method in volume 2 would thus look something like this. Just large enough to be read without a magnifying lens, this entry informs us that a copy of Thomas Aquinas' Questiones quod Libitalis can be found in the Biblioteca Capitular in Tortosa, Spain, that it's number 1 in the printed catalog of the collection by Friedrich Heinrich Suso-Denis and Émile Chatelain that was published in 1856, and that it is in Latin. Here we're getting into the descriptive information, that it dates from the 13th century, that it's in membrane or parchment, and is a quarto volume. In the summary, volume 6, he describes his method in even greater detail, which if done properly would only cost 10 cents per title to produce or 30 cents per title if the card catalog were to be printed. This demonstration experiment proved to Richardson that his method was quick, economical to execute, and easy to reproduce. At the beginning of the project, Richardson estimated that there were over 2,200,000 manuscripts to be included in the catalog. And while a sizable number, it was not, he felt, an impossible one, especially if one kept to what he called his title align method. Once research began, however, he realized that this number was possibly just a fraction of what was actually out there unrecorded. In the survey of manuscript book collections in Spain and Portugal, for example, Grubbs uncovered almost double the 321 collections that Richardson had initially located based on his catalog research. Richardson conceded that his initial underestimation should not have been a surprise, but it did make him realize that if this project were to move forward, it would never be completed in his lifetime. But this fact was not what prevented him from carrying the project forward. By the time he published the 6th volume, the summary of his method, he had lost the backing of the American Library Association, which had supported the first 3 volumes, and was, after alienating most of his colleagues through his forcefully obsessive personality, he was left to publish the last 3 volumes out of his own pocket in 1937, at which point he abandoned the project. He passed away 2 years later, and his vision of a Union World Catalog of manuscripts, as well as his memory, were soon forgotten. To this day, I have not met a medievalist or a manuscript scholar who knew about this project before I mentioned it to him. And here I have to give credit to Stephen Ferguson, the former librarian of special collections at Princeton, who brought Richardson to my attention and Larry Schoenberg's attention, who I'll talk about in just a minute. The downfall of this project can be attributed to several reasons. In the first place, he could never secure enough funding. More damaging, his demonstration method was criticized by manuscript scholars, including Grubbs and Nabi Amin Faris, who did the work on the Oriental manuscripts demonstration, because of too many inaccuracies and errors in the resulting short title entries as published in the preliminary studies and method, which in volume 1, and because they thought that his method didn't capture enough information to be helpful to scholars. It was a far cry, indeed, from more academic approaches to manuscript descriptions that were at the time becoming the gold standard, which gave detailed textual, paleographical, and codicological analysis of the physical features of each manuscript, describing in detail the script or the style of illumination, among many other features. For Richardson, this level of description had no place in what was essentially for him a finding aid, a tool to help scholars in far-flung parts of the world identify on a global scale manuscripts that they might want to know more about. It simply didn't need to be anything more to achieve its goal, and I think his peers who expected higher reflections of academic research had a hard time understanding that. In his preface to the summary of method, he left a passively aggressive parting shot to his critics, singling out his erstwhile collaborator, that illustrates his frustration that his entire motivation behind the project was fundamentally misunderstood. He concludes, "It should be added that whatever the faults of this work, of whatever kind, the general editor is solely responsible." He refused to allow Dr. Grubbs, whose feeling of accuracy was outraged by the publication of uncorrected matter, to take the time to edit out errors. It seemed to the editor, Richardson, and still seems, an attempt to edit carefully at this stage would have cost far more money, and the results without the extensive and inexpensive preliminary standardizing projects described in the following pages would be worthless and misleading. So what lessons can we take from Richardson's project and its failure? The 4 biggest factors limiting Richardson were time, human nature, technology, and as the quotation I just read raises, money. This is true of similar large-scale digitization and cataloging projects even today. The limits of time, the problems of human nature, and money will always exist. We as individuals can only do so much in our lifetime, and we're always going to face human-generated conflicts that will get in the way of plans for any large-scale vision. Richardson didn't have the time, as he well knew, or the patience and understanding to bring others on board and keep them involved in his project, despite the fact that he was working at the top levels of his profession. And then he ran out of funding. So his collaborators moved on and pursued their own ideals of what manuscript description and scholarship should look like. Richardson was left alone in his pursuit of the kind of global international cooperation his catalog of world manuscripts required. The real tragedy is that his method could have been successful if he had been able to achieve the same level of international cooperation to which he had aspired throughout his career. His title-aligned method, while not perfect, was ingenious and cheap. given the innovative technical solutions of his day, that is photostat copying and linotype printing. Rather than focusing on an expensive printed catalog, which was the standard medium of publication, his method of creating essentially a card catalog containing single entries at the top of each card would have created a system that could be added to and edited at any time without the burden of reprinting an entire catalog. Richardson was smart to recognize that the short shelf life of printed catalogs would not work for his enterprise. As soon as they are printed, they are out of date because manuscript collections are not static, and scholarship and knowledge continually develop and change. A good example of this problem is another Union Catalog project that ran contemporaneously with Richardson's, and that is Seymour Dorici's Census of Medieval and Renaissance Manuscripts in the United States and Canada, which was published in 3 volumes between 1935 and 1940. So here's Dorici on the left. So interestingly, Dorici's census was also related to the National Union Catalog of Printed Books project that Richardson oversaw. The idea for the project arose in 1925 at a meeting of the American Council of Learned Societies, where the decision was made to produce a Union catalog or a census of all the medieval manuscripts preserved in North America. Dorici, a British bibliographer with a legendary ability to remember the most minute details of any book he had encountered, was chosen by the ACLS to carry out this project. Dorici published the first volume by 1935, and the second volume was published in 1937, thus completing the census, and the third volume was an index. While the publication of the census was not without its problems, the project was by most accounts a great success. Together, the 2 volumes totaled 2,343 pages and provided summary descriptions of around 15,000 European manuscripts produced before 1600. And here's a typical example of Dorici's method for you to compare to Richardson's. You can see that Dorici also aims for a more abbreviated style of description, but he often strays from that approach, especially when it comes to provenance information. For many years after its publication, the census remained the primary source of information about manuscripts and U.S. collections, even as its information grew increasingly out of date, literally as soon as it was first printed. Maintaining a Union catalog, it became clear, required an ongoing effort as collections are fluid and catalogers make mistakes, and as scholars discover better information about manuscript culture, textual culture in the Middle Ages. So Dorici's census required follow-up, but it wasn't until 1962 that an update was published by C.U. Fay and W.H. Bond, again through the support of the ACLS, which provided a supplement to the census to include manuscripts added to repositories since the 1930s. The ACLS's efforts to maintain an ongoing National Union catalog were noble, but again, by the time the supplement was published, the limitations of the effort were more than apparent. Even the editors of the supplement noted in the foreword that it would already be out of date as soon as it was published, but optimistically wrote that their work would be followed by annual updates in the publications of the Bibliographical Society of America. They concluded by saying, the continued assistance of the community of scholars and collectors is invited for this purpose, so that we will not have to wait another quarter century for further development. Well, unfortunately, this never happened. It's hard to get people to cooperate in this way for a number of reasons, but largely because priorities are shifty. While Dorici was able to achieve more success than Richardson did with his Union World Catalog of Manuscript Books, the census ultimately failed in its overall purpose because of the limits of its technology, and that is the printed book. Dorici also took a more fulsome approach to manuscript description than Richardson did. And while this approach proved to be more palatable and useful to scholars, it was expensive and handicapped the ability to regularly update the census, as it required too much work on the part of specialists to create the descriptions. So in these 2 projects, it would seem that the limitations and roadblocks in the way of their success were certainly time, human nature, and at the end of the day, money. These are the things that even today we face and cannot change. The work is slow and laborious, people's personalities get in the way, and money will always be an issue. But what I found really intriguing about Richardson's project in particular was that he had actually solved the technology barrier with photostatic copying and standardized card cataloging and the related workflow problem in a way that foreshadowed the digital age. Had Richardson conceived and implemented this project today, I think his story would be different. The affordances of digital manuscript description make large-scale cataloging efforts possible. We see this clearly in the initiatives undertaken by institutions around the world working to digitize and catalog thousands of manuscripts and make them available online. And where Richardson's project would have been encumbered by having to deal with millions of cards and linotype slugs, catalogers now work with almost infinite amounts of storage space available to them to store, retrieve, update, and publish information in a matter of seconds. So as you may have guessed by now, I'm a big fan of Richardson's, and his vision for the execution of a world catalog of manuscript books has shaped my own approach to developing online resources for manuscript description and cataloging. Before Digital Scriptorium, I became responsible for a somewhat similar project, although with a different focus. The Schoenberg Database of Manuscripts is a database that I manage, and it collects observations of manuscripts made in auction and sale catalogs, institutional catalogs, and any other source that describes a manuscript at a certain point in time, including people. Any one of you could join the SDBM and make contributions. It now contains over 270,000 entries representing nearly 30,000 actual manuscripts. The Schoenberg database is a bit of an odd duck, and I don't want to spend a lot of time trying to explain it here. It was started in 1997 by Larry Schoenberg, an American collector of manuscripts and a software engineer who was interested in tracking the movements and values of manuscripts across time. Larry had not heard of Richardson until well after he started his database, when Stephen Ferguson approached him at the Grolier Club meeting. But like Richardson's catalog, Larry's approach to manuscript description was to capture from the catalogs only the minimal amount of information required to identify a manuscript. So this is a slide that shows a typical entry in the Schoenberg database. After the source information at the top up here, the manuscript is represented in that source. How that manuscript is represented in that source is described almost as minimally as Richardson described his manuscript. So you just see sort of very brief descriptions of date, materials. There's some longer narrative and binding other information, but we have here in blue authority files that help us to manage the data and make it more easily accessible. So here, just in comparison, is the image that I showed earlier from Richardson's catalog. So again, both projects are only relying on a minimal amount of information to help users identify the manuscripts. The connection from Richardson's catalog to the Schoenberg database is indirect, but as a computer scientist, Larry's understanding of data capture had its foundations in the very same principles that informed Richardson as an information technologist back at the turn of the century. And the same is true for most digital catalogs operating today. Richardson's 120-character description is the pre-digital equivalent of the modern concept of structured digital data. That is, data organized in a predefined format and governed by authorities, making the data elements easy to manage, query, and analyze computationally. Today, we think of structured data as existing in spreadsheets, tables, or knowledge graphs, but these are only mechanisms by which data is expressed. Richardson's analog title align method foreshadowed these digital means of expressing data, and I would propose to you that Richardson's technical solution to the challenges of creating a manuscript catalog on a global scale, which arose out of the modernization of library science at the turn of the century, is an ancestor to modern practices of digital manuscript description. I can say the DS catalog was directly influenced by Richardson's approach. As I noted at the outset, the DS catalog is the technical platform of Digital Scriptorium's Union catalog. Digital Scriptorium was started in 1997 by Consuelo Dutschke at Columbia University and Charles Faulhaber at Berkeley. Dutschke and Faulhaber were early adopters of the digital technology and saw the potential for digitization and revolutionizing manuscript studies by making it possible to put images of manuscripts online so that scholars could study multiple manuscripts from multiple institutions at one time, thus recalling Richardson's words, saving researchers myriads of time and futile hours spent searching for manuscripts to do their research. Digital Scriptorium began with the collections from Columbia and Berkeley and grew into the early 2000s to include over 20 institutions. To contribute data to Digital Scriptorium, institutions were required to create full manuscript descriptions, though, more along the lines of DeRicci rather than Richardson. The descriptions reside at first as semi-structured data in an Access database, then in an XML format using WebGenDB software. The pioneering process more or less worked for about 15 years, and the database eventually grew to about 8,000 manuscripts from about 20 different institutions, including Penn. But by about 2015, things started to break down. This happened for a couple of reasons. The original DS database was not based solely on structured data. There were no built-in standards for data entry, which made searching for manuscripts difficult because, for example, medieval names could be spelled differently in different traditions and languages. The requirement to contribute full descriptive details and large image files became increasingly difficult to maintain over time, and a very complex data model made making updates very difficult. To make matters worse, in 2017, Berkeley, which was hosting the database at the time, told the DS board of directors that it could no longer support the WebGenDB software on its platforms. Further, institutions had stopped contributing revised data because by then most of them had their own online catalogs for their digital collections. For institutions that did not have the resources to create the full descriptions, participating was difficult. Most institutions don't have medievalists on staff to create or update records and cannot afford to bring in specialists to do this work. So the member institutions stopped contributing. Existing records in the database had become redundant and stale, and we started losing membership as well as users. At that point, the consortium was on the verge of experiencing the same fate as Richardson's project, and that is collapse and obsolescence. To make a very long story very short, to save Digital Scriptorium, the board of directors undertook a drastic redevelopment of the platform starting in 2019, and we followed the principles of Richardson's minimal manuscript description and more or less his workflow of distributed labor. We essentially started from scratch and designed a new platform based on linked open data principles and technologies, and these rely on very highly structured data elements. At the outset of the redevelopment process, the DS board of directors, together with a group of stakeholders, a select group, identified the core principles of what the new catalog would be in order to become a sustainable resource. And I list them here. I'm not going to read through them. I'll let you read through them as I sort of talk through them. These principles guided the redevelopment project that was then called DS 2.0, and they continue to guide us even now that the DS catalog has been fully implemented. And they are firmly grounded in Richardson's approach to his union catalog in terms of, one, establishing the scope of the project as simply a finding aid, as an aid to finding pre-modern manuscripts, not providing a definitive description of a manuscript. That's another type of project. We have a reliance on minimal standards for data entry. All you have to do is say that you have a manuscript. You don't have to describe it in any detail if you don't have the resources to do that. Also, the distribution of labor among member institutions to provide a structured manuscript description or metadata to be transformed into and enriched with linked open data authority values. So our approach at first was somewhat controversial among original DS users, especially our decision to abandon hosting images. And it took a lot to convince users that this was the best path forward for sustainability. But in the end, we came up with a platform that is relatively inexpensive to maintain and requires the work of only one full-time data manager to maintain and update the catalog. In addition to the minimal metadata standards, where it most reflects Richardson's approach is in our workflows. Like the process that Richardson used for the National Union Catalog of printed books, our catalog entry is based on structured data supplied by the member institution from their own existing online catalogs and digital files. And we essentially copy the data, thus obviating the need to duplicate efforts in producing different manuscript descriptions, one for the institutional catalog and one for digital scriptorium. So the labor involved in creating this record is distributed. DS does not create the metadata you see here. And sorry if this slide is small. I was trying to get a big enough picture to give you a sense of what the catalog looks like. Rather, we harvest the structured data from the fuller descriptions found in our members' own institutional online catalogs, and we transform it into linked open data values. And these are these underlying values here are from our authorities, and we link to these different authorities. So the Getty, the Thesaurus of Geographic Names, the Art and Architecture of Thesaurus, and we also rely a lot on Wikidata. And through these authorities, through these links, more expansive research on the concept expressed in the record can occur. So thanks to the magic of today's technologies for managing digital data, our processes have worked exceedingly well, and the digital scriptorium has been saved, at least for now. We launched the current DS catalog in 2024 with about 9,000 records transferred from the previous platform that is now obsolete, though records are preserved, PDFs of the records are preserved on the Internet Archive. And we are now circling around 30,000 records representing individual manuscripts, both codices and fragments, from over 45 institutions across the US, and we've only just started. It's been estimated that there are over 100,000 manuscript objects, a number that I think is low. And again, these include both codices and fragments. And it is our goal to represent every one of them in the DS catalog. We just have to keep making the case to existing and prospective members that membership brings added value to the costs of contributing their data in the form of membership dues. And that will continue to be a challenge, especially now as budgets are shrinking and institutions have to start prioritizing where their limited funds go. But it's a worthy challenge that we can, I hope, overcome by learning from the examples of the past. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lynn. That was wonderful.
Sorry I look so dark. I didn't realize how. Is that better? No.
Quite all right. If anybody has any questions, please add them to the Q&A box. I'll get us started. What are some of the what are a few of the larger institutions that are involved, right, with adding things to the digital scriptorium?
Sorry, what was the first part of the question?
What are a few of the larger institutions that are involved?
Oh, so the University of Pennsylvania, Harvard, Berkeley, Yale, who they haven't contributed their data yet, but should be contributing soon. What are some of the, now I'm blanking. I think those are the largest collections. Cornell has a fairly, and Columbia University, of course, and Princeton, which now I think has close to 7,000. They're working on their Islamic manuscripts, and so that's a huge collection of undocumented materials. So was that the question, or sorry?
No, that I was going to say, what does it take for an institution to become involved?
So you have to become a member, and we have a tiered membership fee schedule, and these membership fees go to support that position that I mentioned, the data manager and project manager. And you just have to express an interest. It doesn't take very much. And so we work with members to identify what their tier level is. We have an associate member level if you're a small institution with small collections and small resources. You can join for free. But the larger institutions do support the smaller institutions, and this has always been part of the Digital Scriptorium mission. Contributing data is very easy. We just take the data that you already have. We also have a fellow at the NEH. We received an NEH grant last year for 2 years to support a fellow who will support our member institutions with manuscript description. If you're a member institution and you don't have someone on staff to do this fellow can provide some of that support and at least get, sort of minimal amounts of data into the catalog so that people using the catalog can see that you have a manuscript object, even if it's not fully described. So we've really tried to lower the barriers to access for our member institutions.
Do you anticipate ever working with private collectors who collect these types of manuscripts?
Yes, we've talked about this a lot. We haven't had anybody approach us with interest. And I think we've been focusing more on getting the catalog up and running. But it is something that we would like to do. We would just have to figure out what that level of membership would look like. But yeah, if there are any collectors online, on this meeting, or if you know of anyone, I would love to talk to them about how that would work.
Yeah, I'll keep that in mind. Any questions from the audience attendees? What is your favorite manuscript? Do you have a favorite manuscript to pen or one that you've worked with? I know it's like asking who your favorite kid is or child is, but
Well, actually, I do have a favorite manuscript. It's one that we purchased 2 years ago, and it has a collection of moral and theological diagrams that appear in about 39 other surviving manuscripts around the world. And one of them was the subject of my dissertation. And so this was an unknown copy. It was from the Rookix collection that had been acquired by Bruce McKittrick. And we were able to get it, and it is my favorite manuscript. I've just written a small article on it that'll be published in the fall.
great. Here's a question from Bob Kozovsky. Could you elaborate more on sustainability? Will the promises made today be still in effect 50 years from now?
I hope so. It's hard to envision I was going to say it's hard to envision what's coming down the pipeline, and I guess what's coming down the pipeline is AI, and that's a big question mark. But our goal has been to, something fundamentally changes. Our data is structured and preserved in such a way that it can be taken out of it's not reliant on that catalog that you saw. That was just the user interface. It's built on a Wikibase database, which is the platform that runs Wikidata. So our goal has been to make it to store and manage the data in such a way that, like I said, it can be like reproduced somewhere else. It can be taken down, and because it's basically it can be rendered in a CSV file. It could be rebuilt fairly easily. It's portable.
As Bob says, it's portable.
Yeah. And we started the project and data manager, LP Coladangelo, has started contributing our manuscripts, our DSIDs, to Wikidata. And so there's also, in addition to our Wikibase, manuscripts are now being able you can discover them on Wikidata. So if you're just coming from anywhere. So we have this other place, Wikidata, that we can put a copy of our data. So, in 50 years, what will things look like? I have no idea. But I hope that we've set things up so that we can adapt as things change.
Do you plan on doing any crowdsourcing where
Not
users or
right.
readers can add information?
Not right now. What we do is because our institutions, they're the ones who are managing the content of the record, right? So it's their metadata. So we point users back to the institution. So if they find something in Digital Scriptorium in the catalog and they say, no, I know that this is not this text, it's this text, they should be going back to the member institution so that they can update their catalog. We refresh the data every year. And so there won't be, too much drift between the institutional catalog and a DS catalog record. Yeah.
Nice. Good. A comment from, hold on, let me pull this up. From Miriam Gahn, who's a fascinating talk. I just love the old National Union catalogs and seeing how they are being reimagined in the present. It was nice to see them again. Remember using Nuckmock a while when I first started in the career.
Yeah, no, it's and Richardson's role in developing these things. It's just fascinating. I love his idealism and these large scale projects that had never been. Union catalogs had been attempted before, even back in the Middle Ages to some extent. But there's just so much optimism in these projects, and they deserve, they deserve a lot of respect.
Yes.
Yeah.
Especially with the differences in technology from yesterday and today.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, any additional questions? Well, Lynn, thank you very much for your talk. It was fascinating. Very much enjoyed it. And if Penn is a member of the Manuscript Society, keep an eye, pass on to the Manuscript Society or your graduate students about the Manuscript Society Scholarship Program, the Richard Miles Scholarship Program.
I will.
And also, perhaps Philadelphia can be a place where we visit in a future annual meeting and we can come by and see the wonderful manuscripts in your repository.
Absolutely. We love having people come use our spaces for meetings and conferences, and we would love to host you all and show you around and show you some of our manuscripts, both medieval, pre-modern, and other more modern manuscripts.
Well, that would be wonderful. So, we'll have a great evening, everybody. Thank you very much again to Dr. Lynn Ransom, and we appreciate everybody's attendance and appreciate the time you shared with us, Lynn.
All right. Well,
Have a
thank
great
you.
evening, everybody.